The transport ship hummed with a low vibration as it approached Concord Station. And Ambassador Elena Vasquez pressed her palm against the cold viewport glass to steady herself against the slight tremor in her hands. She had prepared for this moment for 3 years, studying every diplomatic protocol, memorizing the cultural taboos of 12 different species, and learning to control her expressions in ways that would not accidentally start an interstellar incident. But nothing in her training had truly prepared her for the sight before her. Concord Station stretched across the void, like a massive ring of silver and gold, spinning slowly against the backdrop of a distant purple nebula that painted everything in shades of violet and deep blue. The station was enormous beyond human comprehension, built to house representatives from every spacefaring civilization in this arm of the galaxy. And humanity was about to knock on its door and ask to be let inside. Elena turned away from the viewport and looked at the only other human on the transport, Sergeant Major Lucia. Chun sat in the corner of the cabin with her eyes closed and her breathing slow and steady, looking for all the world like she was taking a peaceful nap. Before a routine assignment, she was a small woman by any standard, standing barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, with a compact frame that most people would describe as athletic rather than imposing. Her black hair was pulled back in a tight but that regulations demanded, and her dress uniform was pressed and perfect without a single crease out of place. Anyone looking at her would see a woman who blended into the background, someone easy to overlook and easier to dismiss. Elena knew better. She had read Lucia's file, all 18 pages of it that were not classified beyond her clearance level, and she knew that this quiet woman had survived things that would have broken most soldiers. Lucia had been selected for this mission not because she was the strongest human or the fastest or the most skilled in combat. She had been selected because she understood something that most people never learned. True strength was not about showing off or making threats or proving yourself to everyone who looked at you the wrong way. True strength was about knowing exactly what you were capable of and choosing when and how to demonstrate it. The transport shuddered as it entered the docking sequence, and Elena took a deep breath to center herself. "We're here," she said, her voice steady despite the anxiety churning in her stomach. Lucia opened her eyes, and for just a moment Elena saw something ancient and patient looking back at her, something that reminded her of old Earth predators waiting in tall grass for the perfect moment to strike. Then Lucia smiled, and she was just a friendly soldier again, standing up and smoothing down her uniform with practiced hands. "Ready when you are, Ambassador," Lucia said in a voice that carried no tension or worry at all. Docking clamps engaged with a metallic thunk that echoed through the transport hull, and the airlock began its cycling sequence with a hiss of equalizing pressure. Elena straightened her own formal attire, a flowing robe of deep blue that represented Earth's oceans and the spirit of exploration that had carried humanity to the stars. She checked her translation implant one final time, feeling the small device hum against her temple as it confirmed connection to the station's network. The airlock door slid open, and Elena stepped forward into Concord Station with Lucia 1 pace behind her and to her right. The first thing that hit her was the smell. Station's air carried traces of a dozen different atmospheres, each one filtered and balanced to create something that every species could breathe without dying. But none could breathe comfortably. There were hints of sulfur and copper, of something that reminded her of fresh rain, and of other scents that her human brain could not even begin to categorize. The second thing that hit her was the noise. The docking bay was enormous, stretching up and away in every direction with platforms and walkways at multiple levels to accommodate beings that walked and beings that flew and beings that slithered across surfaces in ways that made her eyes hurt to watch. Voices overlapped in languages that her translator rendered as whispers in her ear. A constant murmur of commerce and conversation and negotiation that never seemed to stop, and everywhere she looked there were aliens she had seen images and videos during her training. But nothing compared to actually standing among them. A group of Velinari drifted past on her left, their crystalline bodies catching the station lights and throwing rainbows across the nearby walls. And they moved without legs or wings in a way that seemed to ignore gravity entirely. A pair of Thracian merchants argued in clicking sounds near a cargo lift, their insectoid bodies covered in chitinous plates of iridescent green and black, and their multifaceted eyes tracked Elena for just a moment before dismissing her as irrelevant. A single Morokai stood in a navigation terminal, towering nearly 10 feet tall with 4 arms and skin the color of dried blood. And it did not even glance in her direction as she passed, but it was the Cathari that made her steps falter for just a heartbeat. There were 7 of them waiting near the exit that led to the diplomatic quarter, and they were exactly as terrifying in person as every briefing had warned her. They would be the smallest of them stood nearly 7 feet tall, covered in scales of mottled gray and brown that shifted color slightly as they moved, and their bodies bristled with quills along their spines and forearms that could extend or retract at will. Their faces were something between a lizard and a wolf, with long snouts filled with teeth and eyes that tracked movement with the cold precision of born hunters. They walked on 2 legs but hunched forward in a way that suggested they could drop to all fours in an instant if the need arose. And every movement they made was smooth and controlled and absolutely deadly. The largest of them turned to watch Elena approach, and she felt the weight of his gaze like a physical pressure against her skin. This was High Adjudicator Rexthal, the senior representative of the Cathari Dominion and one of the most powerful voices on the Concordat Council. He was nearly 8 feet tall with scales of deep green that faded to black at the edges, and his quills were longer and sharper than any of his companions. His eyes were gold with vertical slits for pupils, and they held an intelligence that was both familiar and deeply alien at the same time. Elena stopped at the appropriate distance, exactly 4 meters as protocol demanded, and she touched her palm to her forehead in the Cathari greeting gesture that showed she came with peaceful intentions and empty hands. High Adjudicator Rexthal, she said, her translator rendering her words in the growling consonants of the Cathari tongue. I am Ambassador Elena Vasquez of the United Earth Coalition, and I thank you for receiving us. Rexthal did not return the greeting gesture. Instead, he tilted his head to one side in a motion that her training told her indicated skepticism or mild contempt, and his quills rose slightly along his spine in what might have been amusement or might have been warning. The human delegation arrives at last, he said, and his voice was deep and rough like stones grinding together. We had begun to wonder if your species had changed its mind about seeking membership in the Concordat. His companions made sounds that her translator could not render, but that she understood perfectly well regardless. They were laughing at her. Elena kept her expression neutral and her voice steady. Our journey was long, High Adjudicator, but we are here now and eager to demonstrate humanity's worthiness to join the community of civilized species. Rexthal's eyes shifted past her to Lucia, and his quills flattened slightly in what might have been confusion. This is your security detail, he said, and it was not a question. 1 small female to protect your delegation in a station filled with predators. Elena felt Lucia shift slightly behind her, not in anger or fear, but in something that felt almost like anticipation. Sergeant Major Chun is more than sufficient for our needs. Elena said. Rexthal made a sound that needed no translation. It was dismissal, pure and simple. Come then, human ambassador, he said as he turned away without waiting to see if she would follow. The formal evaluation begins tomorrow, and you will want to rest before then. He paused and looked back over his shoulder with those golden predator eyes. You will need all your strength for what is to come, His companions parted to let him through, and they fell into formation behind him as he walked toward the diplomatic quarter. Elena followed at the appropriate distance with Lucia beside her, and she could feel the gazes of a dozen different species tracking their progress through the station. They were being measured and weighed and found wanting before they had even been given a chance to speak. But Elena had not come all this way to fail, and she had not brought Lucia-chan as a decoration. The Concordat wanted to see what humanity was made of. Soon enough, they would get exactly what they asked for. The ripple of tension that spread through the reception hall was almost visible, like a wave moving through water or a tremor running through solid ground. Every delegate in the chamber had stopped their conversations and turned their attention toward the confrontation unfolding on the central platform, and Elena could feel the collective weight of alien curiosity pressing against her skin. This was not how the evening was supposed to go. She had planned for careful negotiations and measured responses, for the slow building of relationships over weeks or months of patient diplomacy. And now her security attache had just invited the most dangerous predator in the room to name the terms of some kind of challenge. Elena wanted to intervene, to step forward and redirect the conversation back to safer ground. But something in the way Lucia held herself made her hesitate. The sergeant major stood with perfect stillness, her weight balanced evenly on both feet and her hands relaxed at her sides. And there was nothing in her posture that suggested tension or worry or fear. She looked like someone waiting patiently for a bus that she knew would arrive exactly on schedule. Rex still descended from his platform with movements that were fluid and graceful in a way that only true predators could manage. Each step controlled and precise as his clawed feet clicked against the obsidian floor. His companions spread out behind him in a formation that Elena recognized from her briefings as a hunting pattern, designed to cut off escape routes and funnel prey toward the kill zone. But Lucia did not move, did not even glance at the other Cathari as they surrounded her. Her eyes remained fixed on Rexthal as he approached, and when he stopped less than 2 meters away, she had to tilt her head back to look up at him. The height difference was almost comical. He towered over her by nearly 3 feet, his scaled body massive with muscle, and his quills extended in what her translator helpfully identified as a dominance display. She looked like a child standing before a monster from a nightmare, small and fragile and utterly outmatched. You ask what demonstration would satisfy the Concordat? Rexthal said, and his voice was a low rumble that Elena could feel in her chest. Among my people, worthiness is proven through displays of physical dominance. The strong rule and the weak serve, and those who cannot defend themselves do not survive to complain about their treatment. His head lowered until his snout was level with Lucia's face, close enough that she must have been able to smell the meat on his breath. Is this truly what you want, little human, to prove yourself against the standards of the Cathari? The other delegates had formed a loose circle around the confrontation, keeping a safe distance, but unwilling to miss whatever was about to happen. Elena saw the Velinari drifting lower to get a better view, their crystalline bodies pulsing with colors she did not recognize. The Thracians had stopped eating and were watching with all of their compound eyes focused on the scene. Even the Marokai had uncrossed their arms and leaned forward slightly, their red skin darkening in what might have been anticipation. Lucia smiled. It was a small smile, barely a curve of her lips, but Elena saw something in it that made her breath catch in her throat. It was not the smile of a woman who was afraid or outmatched or desperate. It was the smile of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. I do, Lucia said, and her voice carried clearly through the silent chamber. Name your challenge, High Adjudicator, and let us see what humanity is made of. Rexthal pulled back slightly, and Elena saw confusion flicker across his features before it was replaced by something that looked like amusement. You have courage. I will grant you that, he said. Courage or stupidity. It can be difficult to tell the difference with prey species. He straightened to his full height and looked out at the assembled delegates. Very well. Sergeant Major Chun, I propose a simple test of physical capability. One that even your species should be able to understand. His clawed hand gestured to encompass his own massive body. I am the largest Kethari in this chamber, the strongest representative of the apex predators of my world. And I propose that if you can move me from this spot by even a single step, I will personally advocate for humanity's provisional membership in the Concordat. A murmur ran through the crowd, and Elena heard sounds of disbelief and what might have been laughter from several of the species present. She understood why the challenge was impossible. Of Rextol massed at least 400 pounds of dense muscle and bone, and he was planted on the floor with claws that could grip the polished surface like anchors. Lucia was barely half his height and a quarter of his weight, with no claws and no natural weapons and nothing that should have given her even the slightest chance of succeeding. This was not a test. This was public humiliation disguised as an opportunity. Elena stepped forward. High Adjudicator, this challenge is hardly fair, given the physical differences between our species. Surely there must be another way to demonstrate human capabilities that does not rely on raw strength. Rextol's eyes flicked to her, and his quills rippled with something that her translator identified as contempt. The Sergeant Major asked for a challenge. Ambassador, and I have given her one. Would you have me withdraw my offer and admit that humanity is too weak to even attempt such a simple task? He turned back to Lucia with a smile that showed every one of his teeth. Unless your subordinate wishes to decline. Of course, no one would think less of her for admitting that she cannot compete with a Kethari. His companions made sounds of agreement, and Elena saw them exchanging looks that needed no translation. They were already celebrating their victory, but Lucia had not moved, had not flinched, had not shown any sign that she found the challenge impossible or even difficult. I accept, she said simply. The murmur from the crowd grew louder, and Elena saw several delegates shaking their heads or making gestures that she interpreted as sympathy or pity. The Valinari, in particular, seemed agitated, their crystalline forms chiming rapidly as they communicated in frequencies beyond her hearing. One of them drifted forward, an ancient being whose facets had been worn smooth by what must have been centuries of existence. I am Elder Crystal of the Valinari Collective, the being said in a voice like wind chimes, and I offer to serve as formal witness to this challenge, that the terms may be recorded and the outcome honored by all present. Rextol inclined his head in acknowledgement, witnessed and accepted. Elder. He turned back to Lucia with an expression that mixed anticipation with something that might have been respect. One final chance to withdraw. Sergeant Major, there is no shame in recognizing a superior opponent. Lucia's smile widened just slightly. I appreciate your concern, High Adjudicator, but I think we should proceed. She reached up and began unfastening the buttons of her formal jacket with calm, unhurried movements, and the chamber fell absolutely silent as every eye focused on her. Jacket came off, and she folded it neatly before handing it to Elena, who took it automatically without thinking beneath the jacket. Lucia wore a standard military undershirt, sleeveless and form-fitting, and for the first time, the delegates could see what her uniform had been hiding. Her arms were roped with muscle, not the bulging mass of a bodybuilder, but the dense, functional strength of someone who had spent decades training her body for violence. Her shoulders were broader than the jacket had suggested, thick with the kind of development that came from years of lifting and carrying and fighting. Her forearms were corded with tendons that stood out like cables beneath her skin, leading down to hands that were scarred and calloused from countless hours of practice. Several of the delegates made sounds of surprise, and Elena saw Rextol's quills flatten against his body for just a moment before rising again. He had not expected this. He had looked at the small human female in her formal uniform, and seen exactly what she had wanted him to see: a prey animal. Helpless and weak, no threat to anyone. Now he was seeing something else entirely, and the uncertainty in his eyes was the first crack in his absolute confidence. Lucia rolled her shoulders and stretched her neck from side to side. Her movements, casual and relaxed, as if she were preparing for a light workout rather than an impossible challenge. "Shall we begin, High Adjudicator?" she asked, and her voice held nothing but polite inquiry. Rexel's quills rose to their full extension, and his stance widened as his clawed feet dug into the floor. "Whenever you are ready, human." The chamber held its breath. Alana watched as Lucia stepped forward to face the massive predator, her compact body dwarfed by his towering frame, and she felt something shift in the air around them. This was the moment. Everything that happened next would determine humanity's place in the galaxy, and it all rested on the shoulders of one small woman facing impossible odds. Lucia took a deep breath and smiled. "Let's show them what we're made of." The formal reception hall of Concord Station was designed to intimidate visitors, and it succeeded magnificently. Elena stood at the edge of the vast chamber and tried not to let her awe show on her face as she took in the scale of everything. Around her, the ceiling arched overhead at a height that made her neck ache to look at, covered in bioluminescent panels that shifted through colors and patterns that seemed almost alive. Floor beneath her feet was made of something that looked like polished obsidian but felt warm to the touch, and it reflected the lights above in ways that created the illusion of standing on the surface of a dark ocean. Representatives from all 12 member species of the Galactic Concordat had gathered for this reception, and they filled the hall with a riot of shapes and colors and sounds that overwhelmed her senses. The Velinari floated near the ceiling in small groups, their crystalline bodies chiming softly as they communicated in frequencies that her translator could barely detect. The Thracians clustered near the food stations along the walls, their compound eyes watching everything at once while their mandibles clicked in constant conversation. The Morokai stood like statues at various points around the room, their forearms folded across their massive chests as they observed the proceedings with expressions that gave nothing away. And everywhere she looked, there were Ketherithi moved through the crowd like sharks through water, their predator grace making every other species step aside to let them pass. Their quills rippled and shifted as they interacted with the other delegates, displaying emotions and intentions in a language that Elena was only beginning to understand. High Adjudicator Rexthal stood at the center of the room on a raised platform that put him above everyone else present, and he watched Elena's approach with those golden eyes that missed nothing. Lucia walked one pace behind her as always, her dress uniform immaculate and her expression pleasant and completely unthreatening to anyone watching. She looked like exactly what she was supposed to be: small human female in a room full of predators. Doing her best not to attract attention, Elena stopped at the foot of the platform and performed the formal bow that protocol demanded, bending at the waist while keeping her eyes on Rexthal as a sign of respect without submission. "High Adjudicator," she said, and her voice carried across the sudden quiet that had fallen over the nearby delegates. "I thank you for the honor of this reception and for the opportunity to present humanity's petition for membership in the Galactic Concordat." Rexthal's quills rose slightly as he looked down at her from his elevated position. "The honor is ours, Ambassador Vasquez," he said in a tone that made the words sound more like an insult than a courtesy. "It is rare that we receive a petition from such a young species, and many among the Concordat are curious to learn what humanity has to offer." He gestured with one clawed hand toward the assembled delegates, and Elena felt the weight of their attention pressing against her like a physical force. "Please, enlighten us," Rexthal continued. "What does humanity bring to the community of civilized species that we do not already possess?" Elena had prepared for this question. She had spent months crafting her response with help from the finest diplomatic minds on Earth, weighing every word for its impact and its meaning across a dozen different cultures. "Humanity brings our greatest strengths," she said, projecting her voice so that the translation systems could carry her words to every ear in the chamber. "Our adaptability in the face of changing circumstances, our endurance in pursuing goals across generations, and our capacity for cooperation that has allowed us to survive and thrive on one of the most dangerous worlds in known space." She paused to let her words sink in before continuing. "Earth is what the Concordat classifies as a Category 7 death world. High Adjudicator, a planet where nearly everything from the smallest microbe to the largest predator is constantly trying to kill everything else. And humans have not merely survived on this world, but have made ourselves its masters." A murmur rippled through the assembled delegates, and Elena saw several species exchanging looks that her translator could not interpret. The Valinari in particular seemed to pulse with brighter light, their crystalline forms chiming in what might have been surprise or interest, but Rex Thul's expression did not change. "Survival on a death world is commendable," he said in a voice that dripped with condescension. "But survival alone does not make a species worthy of the Concordat. And adaptability is merely another word for not being good enough at anything to rely on natural advantages." His quills rose higher as he leaned forward on the platform, his golden eyes boring into Elena with an intensity that made her want to step back. "Tell me, Ambassador, what natural advantages do humans possess? What weapons has evolution given your species that would make you valuable allies in times of conflict?" Elena kept her voice steady. "We possess the advantage of persistence. High Adjudicator, humans evolved as endurance hunters on the plains of our homeworld, and our bodies are designed to outlast any prey through sheer determination. We cannot run as fast as the creatures we hunted, but we could run longer and we could run farther, and we could track our prey for days, until it collapsed from exhaustion and surrendered to the inevitable." Rex Thul made a sound that her translator rendered as a snort of derision. "Endurance," he repeated. "You speak of chasing helpless prey until it falls down tired, and you call this a strength worth bringing to the Concordat." He straightened to his full height, nearly 8 feet of scaled muscle and barely contained predatory power, and his voice rang out across the silent chamber. "The Cathari do not chase prey, Ambassador. We do not need to wear down our enemies through attrition, because we end our hunts in moments with fang and claw and the strength that evolution has given us. We are apex predators, the culmination of millions of years of selective pressure that has refined our species into the perfect killing machines." He spread his arms wide, displaying the quills that bristled along his forearms like rows of natural daggers. "Your species has no telepathy like the Valinari, no natural armor like the Thracians, no venom like the Morokai, and your technology is derivative at best, copied from the scraps that other species have left behind in your corner of the galaxy." His companions made sounds of agreement, and Elena saw other delegates nodding or making gestures that conveyed similar sentiments. "So I ask you again, Ambassador Vasquez, what does humanity actually offer the Concordat that we do not already have in abundance?" The chamber fell silent, and Elena could feel every eye in the room focused on her, waiting to see how the small human would respond to the challenge that had just been thrown at her feet. She opened her mouth to speak, to deliver the carefully prepared response about human creativity and our capacity for forming alliances across species boundaries. But before she could say a word, Rexthal interrupted her. "Words," he said, and the contempt in his voice was no longer hidden. "All I hear from humanity are words. Claims of strength without evidence and boasts of abilities that cannot be demonstrated." He looked out at the assembled delegates with a predator's smile that showed rows of serrated teeth, The Concordat does not accept species based on their ability to give speeches. We accept species that can demonstrate their worth through action. And so far humanity has shown us nothing but a single female in a borrowed, uniform-speaking borrowed phrases. His gaze dropped to Lucia, who stood motionless behind Elena with her hands clasped behind her back. Is this truly the best that humanity has to offer? Rexthal asked, and his voice carried clearly to every corner of the chamber. A prey species pretending to be something more, hoping that we will be fooled by pretty words and diplomatic niceties. Elena felt anger flare in her chest, hot and sharp. But she forced it down with the discipline that had been drilled into her over years of training. This was a test, she realized. A deliberate provocation designed to see how humanity would respond to insult and dismissal. She was formulating a response when Lucia stepped forward. "Ambassador," Lucia said in a voice that was quiet but carried clearly in the sudden silence, "with your permission, I would like to address the assembly." Elena turned to look at her security attach, and what she saw in Lucia's eyes made her pause. There was no anger there, no wounded pride or desperate need to prove herself. There was only calm certainty and something that looked almost like anticipation. Elena hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Permission granted. Sergeant Major. Lucia walked forward until she stood beside Elena. And then she looked up at Rexthal with an expression of polite interest that seemed entirely out of place given the tension crackling through the chamber. "High Adjudicator," she said, and her translator rendered her words in flawless Cathari that made several of the predators twitch in surprise. "You say that the Concordat accepts species that can demonstrate their worth through action rather than words." Her head tilted to one side in a gesture that mirrored the one Rexthal had used today. Before, what demonstration would satisfy the Concordat's requirements? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Elena saw Rexthal's quills flatten against his body for just an instant before rising again. He had not expected this. She realized he had expected the humans to bluster or apologize or retreat in the face of his contempt, but this. The silence in the reception hall was so complete that Elena could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears like a drum. Every delegate had stopped moving, stopped talking, stopped doing anything except watching the confrontation unfolding in the center of the chamber. Even the constant background hum of the station systems seemed to have faded, as if the universe itself was holding its breath to see what would happen. Next, Lucia stood facing Rexthal with less than 2 meters between them, and the contrast between them was so stark that it bordered on absurd. He was a mountain of scales and muscle and predatory evolution, nearly 8 feet of pure apex killer designed by millions of years of natural selection to dominate every environment he entered. She was a small human woman, compact and muscular, but still barely reaching the middle of his chest, standing in front of him like a sparrow facing a hawk, and yet she showed no fear. Her breathing was slow and steady, her stance relaxed but ready, and her eyes never left his as she waited for the challenge to begin. Rexthal studied her with an intensity that made Elena want to look away, his golden eyes cataloging every detail of her exposed arms and shoulders as if he were measuring prey for the kill. "You are more formidable than I expected," he admitted, and there was a grudging respect in his voice that had not been there before. "Perhaps your species is not entirely without physical merit." His quills rose higher along his spine, extending to their full length in what her translator identified as preparation for conflict. But muscle alone does not determine the outcome of a challenge like this. "Little human, I outweigh you by at least 300 of your pounds, and my claws can grip this floor like anchors in stone." He demonstrated by lifting one foot and then slamming it down, the sound of his claws scraping against the obsidian surface making several nearby delegates flinch. "Even if you had twice your current strength, you could not hope to move me." Lucia tilted her head slightly. Considering his words, perhaps, she said, and her voice was calm enough that she might have been discussing the weather. But the terms of the challenge were simply to move you one step, High Adjudicator. They did not specify that I had to push you backward. Something flickered in Vrexthil's eyes. A brief moment of uncertainty that was gone almost before Elena could register it. The method does not matter, he said. But there was a hint of caution in his voice now. Only the result. If you can move me from this position by any means, I will honor my word. Elder Crystal drifted closer. The ancient Velinari's crystalline form pulsing with pale blue light. The terms are witnessed and recorded, the elder said. High Adjudicator Vrexthil has agreed that if Sergeant Major Chun can move him from his current position by any means, he will personally advocate for humanity's provisional membership in the Galactic Concordat. The elder's form chimed softly as it turned to face the crowd. All present bear witness to this agreement. A murmur of confirmation rippled through the assembled delegates. Voices and sounds from a dozen different species, acknowledging that they had heard and understood the stakes. Vrexthil's companions had spread out further around the confrontation, forming a loose semicircle that blocked any potential escape route. Elena noticed that their quills were raised as well, their postures tense with anticipation. And she realized that they expected this to end badly for Lucia. They expected their leader to demonstrate the superiority of the Cathari by humiliating the small human who had dared to challenge him. And they were positioning themselves to witness the victory up close, but there were other observers as well. Delegates from species that had no stake in the outcome, except curiosity about these new arrivals to the galactic stage. The Thracians had moved closer, their compound eyes tracking every movement with the precision of beings that saw in 360 degrees. Marakai had actually taken several steps forward, their massive forms looming over the smaller species around them, and their red skin had darkened to almost black in what Elena's training told her was intense interest. Even the Volinari had descended from their usual positions near the ceiling, drifting in a slowly rotating formation around the confrontation. Like satellites orbiting a star, they were all waiting to see what humanity was capable of. They were all waiting to see if this small woman could do the impossible. Lucia seemed oblivious to the attention, her focus entirely on the predators standing in front of her. She rolled her shoulders one more time and then dropped into a stance that Elena recognized from her briefings on human combat techniques. Her feet shoulder-width apart and her weight balanced on the balls of her feet. Are you ready, High Adjudicator? She asked. Vrexthil's quills rippled with what might have been amusement or anticipation. I have been ready since you accepted my challenge. Human. He planted his feet more firmly and dug his claws into the floor, his massive body tensing with the effort of anchoring himself in place. His companions made sounds of encouragement, their own quills rising in solidarity with their leader. Whenever you wish to begin, Vrexthil said, and his smile showed rows of serrated teeth. Take all the time you need to gather your strength. You will need every bit of it. Lucia did not respond. Instead, she simply stepped forward, closing the distance between them until she was standing directly in front of him. Her head barely reached the bottom of his chest, and she had to crane her neck back to look up at his face from this close. The difference in their sizes was even more pronounced. He could have crushed her with one sweep of his massive arm, could have torn her apart with his claws before she could even raise her hands in defense, but he did not move. Held in place by the terms of the challenge he had set and by his own absolute confidence in his victory, Lucia studied his stance for a moment, her eyes tracking over his body with a clinical detachment that seemed at odds with the tension crackling through the chamber. She noted the way his weight was distributed, the angle of his feet, the position of his claws against the floor, and then she looked up at his face and smiled. You know, she said in a conversational tone, my trainers on Earth always said that the key to any physical challenge is understanding the principles involved. Her hands came up to rest lightly against his abdomen, palms flat against his scales, and he looked down at her with an expression of bemused tolerance. "Is this your strategy? Human, to talk me into moving?" Lucia's smile widened. "Not exactly. High Adjudicator, but before we begin, I thought you might appreciate a brief lesson in human evolutionary biology." She pressed her palms more firmly against his scales, feeling the heat of his body and the steel-hard muscles beneath his skin. "You asked what natural advantages humans possess, and I told the ambassador about our persistence hunting. But there's another aspect of our evolution that I didn't mention." Her fingers curled slightly, finding purchase against the ridges between his scales. Humans evolved on a world with gravity that is 1.4 times the Concordat standard. High Adjudicator, every step we take, every movement we make, is done while carrying weight that would crush most other species. She felt his muscles tense slightly beneath her hands. The first sign of uncertainty she had detected since the challenge began. "Our bones are denser than yours, designed to support that weight without breaking. And our muscles are anchored to those bones with tendons that can withstand forces that would tear other species apart." Her stance shifted slightly, her feet spreading wider and her center of gravity dropping lower. "We don't look like predators because we never needed to. We had something better than claws and fangs and armor." She looked up at him with eyes that held something ancient and patient and absolutely merciless. "We had the strength to never give up, no matter how big the prey." Rex, though his quills had flattened against his body, and his golden eyes had widened with the first real fear Elena had seen in him since they arrived. He opened his mouth to speak, to call off the challenge perhaps, or to demand that she step back. But before he could say anything, Lucia moved and the impossible happened. The chamber had grown so quiet that Elena could hear the soft hum of the bioluminescent panels overhead shifting through their endless color patterns. Every delegate stood frozen in place, their attention locked on the small human woman standing before the massive HFY predator with her hands pressed against his scaled abdomen. Lucia's words had created ripples of confusion and uncertainty throughout the room, and Elena could see delegates exchanging glances that needed no translation. What was she doing? Why was she talking about gravity and bones instead of preparing to fail? Vrexel himself seemed thrown off balance by her calm explanation, his quills having flattened in what her training told her was uncertainty rather than aggression. He had expected fear or bravado or desperate struggle, not a composed lecture on evolutionary biology delivered by someone who should have been terrified. "You speak of gravity as if it matters here," he said, and there was a defensive edge to his voice that had not been there before. "The Concordat standard was chosen because it represents the average across all member worlds, not because it favors any particular species." Lucia nodded as if he had made an excellent point. "You're absolutely right. High Adjudicator, the standard was chosen to accommodate the widest range of species possible, which means it was calibrated to the median rather than the extremes." Her fingers adjusted their grip against his scales, finding the natural grooves and ridges that gave her purchase without seeming threatening. "But humans are not from a median world. We are from an extreme world, a Category 7 death world, where everything is bigger and heavier and more dangerous than the galactic average." She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in. "The Kethare homeworld has gravity that is approximately 0.8 times Concordat standard, doesn't it?" The question hung in the air, and Elena saw Vrexthew's companion stiffen with sudden alarm. This was not widely known information outside of certain diplomatic and scientific circles, and the fact that Lucia had, it suggested that humanity had done far more research on potential adversaries than anyone had expected. "Our world's gravity is not relevant to this challenge," Rex still said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Strength is strength, regardless of where it was developed. Lucia shook her head slowly, with respect. High Adjudicator, that's not quite accurate. You see, gravity shapes everything about how a species evolves. She shifted her stance slightly, her weight settling more firmly into her legs. Bones grow denser under higher gravity because they need to support more weight. Muscles develop differently because they have to work harder with every single movement. Even the way our bodies are proportioned changes based on the gravitational forces we experience from birth. Her eyes never left his as she continued. Humans are shorter than many species precisely because height is expensive in high gravity. Every additional inch of height means more stress on the spine, more strain on the heart, more energy required just to stay upright. She smiled, and there was something predatory in the expression that made Rexthol's quills twitch. We traded height for density. High Adjudicator, we are compact because compact is efficient when you live under crushing weight. And we are strong because weak creatures don't survive on worlds like ours. The Morokai delegation had moved even closer, their massive red forms pressing against the edge of the watching crowd. And Elena saw their forearms flexing with what might have been anticipation. They understood what Lucia was describing better than most because their own world was considered high gravity by Concordat standards, though not as extreme as Earth. I have heard enough of your lesson, Rexthol growled. And his quills began to rise again as his patience wore thin. If you truly believe that your gravity makes you strong enough to move me, then stop talking and prove it. Lucia's expression did not change. I intend to, High Adjudicator. But I wanted you to understand what you were seeing before it happened. Her hands pressed more firmly against his abdomen, and she took a slow, deep breath that Elena could see expanding her ribcage. You see, the Kethari are ambush predators. Your hunting strategy evolved around explosive bursts of speed and power designed to overwhelm prey in seconds. She exhaled slowly, her body relaxing into a state of focused readiness. But humans are persistence predators. We don't need explosive power because that's not how we hunt. We hunt by never stopping, by outlasting our prey through sheer relentless endurance. Her legs tensed, the muscles in her thighs and calves standing out like cables. Beneath her uniform pants, our ancestors would chase animals across the African savanna for hours, sometimes days, running and walking and tracking until the prey collapsed from exhaustion. She looked up at him with eyes that held no fear at all. We were never the fastest or the strongest or the most dangerous, but we were always the most stubborn. And in the end, that mattered more than anything else. Rexthol's quills were fully extended now, his body tensing with the instinctive response of a predator facing something it did not understand. You cannot move me through stubbornness alone. Human. Lucia's smile widened. No, High Adjudicator. I cannot. Her grip tightened against his scales, but I can move you through leverage and physics, and the strength that comes from a lifetime of fighting against gravity that would crush you if you tried to visit my world. The chamber held its breath. Elena saw Lucia's body shift, saw her center of gravity drop as her knees bent and her hips lowered, saw her arms slide around Rexthol's massive torso until her hands locked together behind his back. She was hugging him. Elena realized with sudden shock. She was wrapping her arms around the largest predator in the room like a child, embracing a parent, but there was nothing childlike about the way her muscles were tensing beneath her skin. Nothing innocent about the way her feet were planting themselves against the floor. Here's something else you should know about humans, Lucia said, her voice slightly muffled against his scales. We developed a sport called weightlifting, High Adjudicator. A game where we see how much mass we can lift using nothing but our own bodies. Her back straightened, her legs driving upward with slow, inexorable force. The strongest humans can lift over 1,000 pounds in certain exercises, more than twice your body weight. And while I'm not quite that strong, she paused. And Elena saw the muscles in her back and shoulders bunch with effort. "I'm strong enough." Rexthol made a sound that might have been surprise or disbelief or fear, and his claws scraped against the floor as he felt himself being lifted, his quills flattened involuntarily against his body, and his arms came up in an instinctive attempt to maintain balance. "What are you?" he started to say, but his voice cut off as his feet left the ground. Lucia was lifting him. The small human woman was actually lifting the 400-pound apex predator off the floor. Her arms locked around his torso and her legs, driving upward with power that seemed impossible from a body her size. The chamber erupted in chaos, voices and sounds overlapping as delegates from a dozen species reacted to what they were witnessing. The Velinari were chiming so rapidly that the sound became a continuous ringing tone. Da-da. Thracians were clicking their mandibles in what might have been shock or excitement. Morokai were rumbling deep in their chests, a sound that Elena's translator could not render, but that she understood anyway. They were impressed. They were witnessing something that challenged everything they thought they knew about humans, and they could not look away. Lucia held Rexthol suspended in the air for one heartbeat, then two, then three, his clawed feet dangling uselessly above the floor, and his golden eyes wide with an emotion that Elena had never expected to see on a Kethari face. It was fear pure. Primal, instinctive fear. The apex predator of his world was being held aloft by a creature half his size, and everything he thought he knew about the universe was crumbling around him. Then Lucia set him down gently, carefully, with none of the violence or aggression that he would have shown if their positions were reversed. She placed his feet back on the floor and released a grip on his torso, stepping back to a respectful distance and straightening her spine with a soft crack. "One step, High Adjudicator," she said, and her voice was slightly breathless but still calm. Or rather, no steps at all while your feet were off the ground. She smiled at him, and there was no mockery in the expression, only quiet satisfaction. "I believe I've satisfied the terms of your challenge." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Elena had ever experienced. It pressed against her ears like a physical weight, filled with the collective shock of 12 different species trying to process what they had just witnessed. Rexel stood exactly where Lucia had placed him, his clawed feet planted firmly on the obsidian floor, and his massive body motionless except for the rapid rise and fall of his chest. Quills had flattened completely against his skull and spine, pressed so tightly against his scales that he almost looked like a different creature entirely. Elena recognized the posture from her briefings, though she had never expected to see it displayed by a High Adjudicator of the Kethari Dominion. It was a submission display, an involuntary response triggered by being physically dominated by another being. And among the Kethari, it was considered one of the most profound statements of inferiority that could be mad at. Rexthol was displaying it to a human his companions had frozen in their hunting formation around the confrontation, their own quills twitching between aggression and confusion as they struggled to reconcile what they had seen with everything they believed about the universe. One of them, a female with scales of mottled gray, took a hesitant step forward, as if she wanted to help her leader, but did not know how. "High Adjudicator," she said, her voice uncertain. "Are you injured?" Rexthol did not respond immediately. He was staring at Lucia with an expression that Elena could not quite read, something that mixed shock with reassessment, with the dawning realization that he had made a terrible mistake in judgment. His golden eyes traveled over her compact frame with new understanding, seeing not the helpless prey animal he had dismissed, but something far more dangerous. "I am unharmed," he said finally, and his voice was hoarse in a way that suggested his throat had gone dry. "The human was careful not to injure me." He paused, and Elena saw him swallow hard before continuing. "She could have, I think. She had me at her mercy, and she chose to be gentle. The words sent another ripple of reaction through the assembled delegates. The Valinari were pulsing with colors that Elena's translator struggled to interpret. Their crystalline forms chiming in frequencies that range from subsonic rumbles to piercing tones. Beyond human hearing, Elder Crystal drifted forward. The ancient being's form shimmering with pale gold light that her training told her indicated profound interest. "The challenge has been witnessed," the elder said, and their voice carried to every corner of the chamber. "Sergeant Major Chun has not merely moved High Adjudicator Rexthal from his position. She has lifted him entirely from the ground and held him suspended in the air." The elder turned to face the crowd, their crystalline facets catching the bioluminescent light from above. "The terms of the challenge have been more than satisfied. Do any present dispute this assessment?" No one spoke. The chamber remained silent as the reality of what had happened slowly sank into the consciousness of every delegate present, a human. A member of a species that most had dismissed as unremarkable at best and worthless at worst, had just demonstrated physical capabilities that exceeded anything they had expected. Lucia stood calmly in the center of the attention, her breathing returning to normal and her muscles relaxing from the effort of the lift. She had not moved to celebrate or boast or gloat over her victory, had not made any gesture that might be interpreted as rubbing her success in the Cathari faces. She simply waited, patient and composed, for whatever would happen next. The Thracians broke the silence first, their mandibles clicking in a pattern that her translator rendered as surprised approval. "Impressive," one of them said, their compound eyes tracking over Lucia's frame with new appreciation. "We had not believed the reports of human physical capability. They seemed exaggerated to the point of fantasy." Another Thracian clicked in agreement. "Our scientists theorized that no species could develop such strength without sacrificing other attributes like intelligence or social cooperation. Yet here stands proof that we were wrong." The Marakai delegate stepped forward, his massive four-armed form casting a shadow over the watching crowd. He was even larger than Rexthal, standing nearly 10 feet tall with skin the color of dried blood and muscles that bulged beneath his surface like boulders beneath sand. "I am Kragath of the Marakai Collective," he rumbled, and his voice was so deep that Elena felt it in her bones. "My people come from a high-gravity world as well, though not so extreme as the human homeworld." He stopped in front of Lucia and looked down at her with four eyes that gleamed like polished obsidian. "We had heard rumors of human strength, whispers that suggested your species was more than it appeared. But we dismissed them as propaganda designed to make you seem more formidable than you were." His forearms spread wide in a gesture that her translator identified as acknowledgement of error. "We were wrong, and I am pleased to say so. It is not often that a new species surprises us." Lucia inclined her head in a gesture of respect. "Thank you, Delegate Kragath. The Marakai reputation for honorable dealing is well known among my people." Kragath made a sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been a growl of approval. "She has manners as well as muscle. This one, humanity has chosen their representative wisely." More delegates were pressing forward now, their earlier dismissal of the human delegation replaced by curiosity and something that looked almost like eagerness. The Valinari were asking questions through Elder Crystal about human physiology and evolutionary history, wanting to understand how such strength could develop in a species that appeared so unremarkable. The Thracians were discussing among themselves the implications of humanity's physical capabilities for potential trade and military alliances. Even some of the Cathari companions had begun to relax their aggressive postures, their quills settling into patterns that suggested respect rather than hostility. But it was Rexthal's reaction that Elena watched most closely. The High Adjudicator had not moved from where Lucia had placed him, had not spoken since acknowledging that he was unharmed. His quills were slowly rising from their flattened submission posture, and something was shifting in his expression that she could not quite identify. Was it anger? Resentment at being humiliated in front of the entire Concordat? Was it fear? The instinctive response of a predator who had discovered that he was not at the top of the food chain. After all, or was it something else entirely? Something that her training had not prepared her to recognize. Sergeant Major Chun, Rexthal said, and his voice had changed in some subtle way that made everyone in the chamber fall silent again. Lucia turned to face him, her expression neutral and her posture relaxed. Yes, High Adjudicator. Rexthal studied her for a long moment, his golden eyes moving over her face as if he were seeing her for the first time. I owe you an apology, he said, and the words seemed to cost him something. I made assumptions about your species based on appearance rather than evidence, and I paid the price for that arrogance. His quills rose higher, shifting into a pattern that her translator identified as formal acknowledgement. You have humbled me in front of my peers and my subordinates, and by the customs of my people, I should hate you for it. He paused, and something almost like a smile crossed his alien features. But I find that I do not. Elena felt her breath catch in her throat. This was not the reaction she had expected, not the response that any of her briefings had prepared her for. Teth'ari were supposed to be rigid hierarchical thinkers, unable to accept defeat without resorting to violence or nursing grudges for generations. Yet here was their highest representative in this chamber, publicly acknowledging that he had been wrong. Why not? Lucia asked, and there was genuine curiosity in her voice. Rexel's smile widened, showing teeth in a way that seemed more amused than threatening. Because you could have hurt me. Sergeant Major, you had the strength to crush my ribs or break my spine. Yet you chose to be gentle. He inclined his head in a gesture that her translator has profound respect. Among my people, that is the mark of a true predator, not one who kills because they can, but one who chooses when and how to demonstrate their power. He extended one clawed hand toward her, palm up, in what Elena recognized as the Keth'ari gesture of offered alliance. You are not prey. Sergeant Major Chun, you never were, and I was a fool not to see it. Lucia looked at the offered hand for a moment, and then she reached out and placed her own smaller hand in his massive palm. I am glad we understand each other. High Adjudicator. Rex threw his fingers closed gently around hers, claws carefully retracted to avoid scratching her skin. As am I, human, as am I. The vote for provisional membership took less than 5 minutes. Elena stood before the assembled council of the Galactic Concordat with Lucia at her side, watching as representatives from 12 species cast their decisions in a ceremony that had not changed in 3,000 years of galactic history. The Velinari went first, as they always did, their crystalline forms pulsing with the pale gold of cautious approval as Elder Christhimal announced their vote in favor of humanity's admission. The Thracians followed, their compound eyes tracking over the human delegation as their representative clicked a formal acceptance that her translator rendered with what sounded like genuine enthusiasm. The Marakai voted yes with a rumbling acknowledgement from Delegate Kragath that made the floor vibrate beneath Elena's feet one by one. The other species added their voices to the growing consensus. The Jurati, a species of small furry beings that Elena had barely noticed at the reception, voted yes with squeaking sounds of excitement. The Nethrani, tall willowy creatures with skin like bark and leaves growing from their heads, voted yes with slow deliberate movements that conveyed ancient patience. The Cracian, the Voldari, the Thaumian, the Oruskai, all voted in favor of humanity's provisional membership. When Vrexthal rose to cast the Keth'ari vote, the chamber fell silent with anticipation. He had promised to advocate for humanity if Lucia succeeded in her challenge. But promises made in the heat of confrontation did not always survive the cold light of political calculation. The High Adjudicator looked down at the human delegation from his elevated position on the council platform, his golden eyes moving from Elena to Lucia and back again. The Cathari Dominion has long prided itself on our ability to recognize strength, he said, and his voice carried to every corner of the chamber. We value power and capability, and the willingness to use both when necessary. His quills rose into the pattern of formal declaration. Yesterday, I made an error in judgment. I looked at these humans and saw only their size, only their apparent weakness, only the absence of claws and fangs and armor. He paused, letting the silence stretch. I did not look closely enough to see the truth. His gaze fixed on Lucia. I did not see the strength that hides beneath soft skin. Did not see the endurance that comes from a world that would crush most species. Did not see the fire that burns in the hearts of beings who have conquered their own death world and now reach for the stars. He spread his arms wide in a gesture that her translator identified as formal endorsement. The Cathari Dominion votes in favor of humanity's provisional membership in the Galactic Concordat, and we do so not out of obligation to a promise made, but out of genuine recognition of their worth. His teeth showed in what Elena now recognized as a buy. Cathari smile. We look forward to hunting alongside our new allies. The vote was unanimous. Elder Crystal drifted to the center of the council platform, the ancient Velinarius crystalline form shimmering with every color in the visible spectrum. By unanimous decision of the council, the species known as humanity is hereby granted provisional membership in the Galactic Concordat, subject to the standard requirements of documentation, diplomatic exchange, and demonstration of peaceful intentions. The elder turned to face Elena directly. Ambassador Vass. The handshake between Lucia and Rexthal seemed to unlock something in the chamber, releasing a tension that had been building since the moment the human delegation arrived. Delegates who had been watching from a cautious distance began moving closer, their earlier dismissal replaced by curiosity that bordered on eagerness. The Valinari were chiming questions faster than Elena's translator could process them, their crystalline forms pulsing with colors that shifted through the entire visible spectrum and beyond. The Thracians had formed a tight cluster near the edge of the crowd, their mandibles clicking in what sounded like rapid-fire debate about trade implications and alliance possibilities. Even the other Cathari had relaxed their aggressive postures, their quills settling into patterns that her training told her indicated acceptance rather than hostility. But Lucia was not finished. She released Rexthal's hand and turned to face the assembled delegates, and something in her expression made the noise in the chamber fade to silence. High Adjudicator Rexthal was gracious in his acknowledgement, she said, and her voice carried to every corner of the room. But I want to make something clear to everyone present. She paused, letting the attention settle on her like a physical weight. I am not special among my kind. The statement landed like a bomb in the quiet chamber, and Elena saw several delegates exchange confused glances. A Thracian near the front clicked their mandibles in what her translator rendered as disbelief. You just lifted a being 4 times your mass, the insectoid said. If you are not special, then what are the special humans capable of? Lucia smiled, and there was something in the expression that made Elena think of wolves showing their teeth. Earth has 8 billion humans, she said. Many of them are stronger than me, faster than me, more dangerous than me in ways that have nothing to do with physical strength. She began to pace slowly, her compact body moving with the casual grace of someone who was completely comfortable in their own skin. Our world has produced athletes who can run at speeds exceeding 27 miles per hour, warriors who can fight for hours without rest, scientists who have split the atom and walked on our moon and created artificial intelligences that can process information faster than organic minds. Her pacing brought her to the edge of the Moroccan delegation. And she looked up at the massive red-skinned beings without a trace of intimidation. We tamed wolves, the apex pack predators of our world, and we made them into pets that sleep in our beds and play with our children. She turned to face the Thracians. We hunted mammoths, creatures that stood 13 feet tall at the shoulder and weighed 12,000 pounds. And we drove them to extinction using nothing but pointed sticks and coordination. She moved toward the Volinari, the crystalline beings drifting back slightly as she approached. We have walked across continents that would kill most species in hours, climbed mountains where the air is too thin to breathe, dived into oceans so deep that the pressure would crush any vessel the Concordat has designed. She stopped in the center of the chamber and turned in a slow circle, meeting the eyes of every delegate she could see. We did not evolve on our world. We conquered it, and when there was nothing left to conquer on Earth, we looked up at the stars and decided to come. Here, the silence that followed her words was different from the silence that had come before. This was not the shock of witnessing something unexpected or the confusion of having assumptions overturned. This was the silence of beings who were genuinely afraid for the first time in their long association with new species. Rexel broke the tension with a sound that started as a rumble in his chest and built into something that took Elena a moment to recognize. He was laughing, not the mocking laughter of contempt or the nervous laughter of fear, but genuine, full-bodied amusement that made his quills ripple and his companions stare at him in confusion. "You are trying to frighten us," he said when the laughter subsided, and his golden eyes gleamed with something that looked almost like delight. "You want us to look at you and see monsters." Lucia tilted her head in that gesture she had borrowed from him. "Is it working?" Rexthal laughed again, shorter this time. "On some of them, perhaps." He gestured toward the Velinari, who had retreated to the far side of the chamber and were pulsing with deep violet light that her translator identified as extreme caution. The crystalline ones looked ready to flee the station entirely. He turned back to Lucia with an expression that mixed respect with something that might have been fondness. "But you do not frighten me, Sergeant Major, not because I do not believe you are dangerous, but because I have seen how you handle your strength." His quills rose into a pattern that her translator could not identify. "You could have injured me during our challenge, could have dropped me to the floor or thrown me across the chamber, but you chose to be gentle." He stepped closer to her, close enough that he could have touched her with an outstretched hand. "That tells me more about humanity than any demonstration of strength. It tells me that your species knows how to control its power, how to be dangerous without being destructive." He turned to face the assembled delegates. "That is not the mark of monsters," he said, and his voice rang out across the chamber. "That is the mark of potential allies. Beings who can be trusted with power because they understand the responsibility that comes with it." The Morokai delegate Kragoth stepped forward, his forearms folded across his massive chest. "The Morokai Collective agrees," he rumbled. "We have tested humanity and found them worthy, not of fear but of respect." One of the Thracians clicked their mandibles. "The Thracian hives concur. A species with such capabilities would be a valuable addition to the Concordat, particularly in light of certain threats that have been growing beyond our borders." Elder Crystal drifted forward, the ancient Velinari S-form still pulsing with cautious violet but streaked now with threads of pale gold. "The Velinari Collective reserves judgment until we have conducted additional research into human capabilities and intentions, but we acknowledge that this demonstration has exceeded our expectations." The elder turned to face Elena, Ambassador Vasquez. "The formal vote for provisional membership will be held tomorrow as scheduled, but I believe you will find that the sentiment in this chamber has shifted considerably since your arrival." Elena stepped forward, her diplomat's instincts finally catching up with the chaos of the evening. Thank you, Elder Crystal. And thank you to all the delegates who have witnessed this demonstration with open minds. She looked at Lucia, who had returned to her position one pace behind and to the right, her expression once again pleasant and unthreatening. Humanity did not come to the stars to frighten or threaten or dominate. Elena said, "We came because exploration is in our nature, because the same stubbornness that made us persistence hunters on our homeworld makes us unwilling to accept limits on what we can achieve." She spread her hands in a gesture of openness. "We want to be part of the Concordat, not because we need your protection or your technology, but because we believe that cooperation makes everyone stronger." She met Vrexto's eyes. "We came here today to show you what we are capable of, and we have done so. But what we truly want is to show you what we can become together." Vrextel's quills rose into what her translator finally identified as approval. "Well spoken, Ambassador. I believe I speak for the Cathari Dominion when I say that we look forward to learning more about what humans can become." He glanced at Lucia with something like a smile. "And I would like to know more about how your species developed such formidable strength. My own people might benefit from learning your training techniques." Lucia smiled back at him. "I would be happy to share what I know, High Adjudicator, though I should warn you that some of our methods are quite intense." Rextol's smile widened, showing teeth. "Sergeant Major, after what you just demonstrated, I would expect nothing less." The tension in the chamber had completely dissolved now, replaced by a buzzing energy of curiosity and possibility. Delegates were breaking into small groups to discuss what they had seen, some approaching the human delegation with questions and others hanging back but watching with obvious interest the reception. That was supposed to be a formal evaluation had become something else entirely. It had become a beginning. Elena felt the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. The understanding that everything she did and said from this point forward would shape the relationship between humanity and the rest of the galaxy. But for the first time since they arrived, she did not feel afraid. She felt ready.